This is the Marriage Podcast, and I'm your host, Alexandra Stockwell. I'm a physician turned relationship and intimacy expert, and I specialize in showing couples how to have incredible, passionate relationships. I myself have been married for 25 years. My husband and I have 4 children and full professional lives, and we've created an amazing relationship. If you want to deepen your understanding of your own relationship and learn to access new heights of emotional, sensual, and erotic intimacy, you're in the right place because I will show you how. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, this is Alexandra, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Vanessa Calderon. Do you want to say it your way? I can't roll my R with
Vanessa Calderon.
That is who we have the pleasure of speaking with. I was up late at an incredible wedding where the music was very loud, and you can hear that in my voice today, but I didn't want to postpone this conversation because I've been so excited to have it. Dr. Calderon, well, I don't know if it's better to just say it with an American accent or try. What's the correct thing with that?
I think you do your best, and most everyone will give you grace. So Calderon, however you want to say it, jives with me.
Thank you. So she is a Latina life and leadership coach and a board certified emergency medicine physician. She is also a fantastic woman with her husband for 13 years, married for 9, with 2 children who are 4 and 7 years old. And I had the absolute privilege and delight of hearing you interviewed on Kelly Casperson's podcast, where you talked about really the most important topic that we face generally, and that is burnout and stress management and how it affects our relationships. It is so easy to think, oh, I married the wrong person. But in fact, if you learn how to manage your burnout and stress, you may discover that the person you're married to is suddenly a lot more appealing. So that's the context for our conversation. I really want to dive in. But before we do that, I just feel really honored to have you on and want you to talk a little bit about the Latina Leadership Accelerator. Will you say what that is, what brings you to be leading in this beautiful way?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, by the way. It's such a pleasure to be here. And you guys can't see us, but Alexandra's wearing the most beautiful, passionate red shirt, and red is my favorite color. So my background is red. So it's a perfect match. So I have over 20 years of leadership experience. I've been leading in hospitals, department chair, med exec, those types of positions for many, many years. I also happen to be Latina, and there's not a lot of us out there. And it wasn't hard to figure out that there weren't very many women, and of the women, very, very few Latinas. You know, of the women leading right now, especially in executive roles, it's about 20% women. And of those, there's about 5 to 1 white women to women of color. And so there's clearly a huge deficit. And everybody knows that when we have neurodiversity in leadership, everyone prospers, everyone succeeds. Profits go up, budgets go up, people start thinking differently, more creatively. It's just a better place for everyone when we have leadership that's diverse. And for me, it was so obvious for me, you know, when I first started my very first clinical department chair role, I was hired as just a regular physician, and I was only one of 2 women. And within a year, I became the department chair. And about a year and a half later, when you looked at the people that were working there, 50% of them were women. And I had built up this beautiful medical director management team. We had a whole team of leaders, and half of them were women. And that's what happens when women lead. When women lead, they pull up other women. When women lead, they make choices, decisions, policies that support other women in leadership, support them to take time off, support them to, you know, transition back to the workforce successfully after having kids. And so for me, it's just so obvious why it's so important to have women in leadership, but especially, you know, Latinas, because when Latinas lead, we lead with authenticity. We're always supporting our culture. We're always looking for ways that we can really pull up people behind us. And that's really important. And I'm all about my community. And so the Latina Leadership Accelerator is it's kind of like a forum it's a 6-month program for Latinas at all levels of their career. We dive deep into both personal and professional development. I teach them everything they need to know about leadership, basic negotiations, managing teams, how to speak in public, how to, so much of speaking is your nonverbal cues, your presentations and how to have those on point for speaking. I teach them all about their money mindset and wealth. And then we do a huge deep dive into emotional intelligence, or what I call the personal development part, which is everything: confidence, letting go of self-doubt, how guilt doesn't have to run your life. Many of us that were raised in religious backgrounds, and for Latinas, a lot of us were raised in Catholic churches. For many of us, guilt is such a huge part of, with what we think we need for our moral compass. And it unfortunately kind of gets involved in so many other ways that it sets us up to kind of fail sometimes, to make decisions that are not based on integrity, but based on guilt. And so we dive deep into all of those sort of personal development topics, and it's a fantastic program. So anyone that's interested, you can find my website, vanessacalderonmd.com. But okay, enough about the Latina Leadership Accelerator.
Okay, actually, there is one thing that I do want to pick up on, because first of all, I love that you've presenced all of that, because it's going to make the conversation we now have so much richer for everyone. And you did say, as you described this fantastic program, that personal development and business development go hand in hand. That wasn't the phrase you used, but that's what you meant. Will you speak to that a little bit? Like, how does that work? I see this so often where when someone puts attention and effort into their personal development and really does what's necessary to improve their relationships, that immediately has a positive ripple effect in their business and career accomplishments. However, the data is very clear, the data that I'm familiar with, that the reverse is not necessarily true. And in fact, the more successful people become in business and career, the greater statistical likelihood that they will be unfulfilled by their relationships. First of all, is that the same data that you've seen? And what are your thoughts on this phenomenon, since you're so connected with so many people's lives, both in personal development and in professional development?
You just mentioned so many good things there. Okay, so number one, why is personal and professional development? Why do those things go hand in hand? And why do I always say them in the same sentence? Because exactly what you said, it is so true. Transformative leaders, women and men that are leading now, that we actually call transformative leaders, people that are making a difference right now in the world, they're not the old school leaders that we used to think, needed to lead authoritatively, needed to just like speak right, and was so afraid to be wrong, all those types of things. Transformative leaders stand up and speak authentically. Transformative leaders are able to inspire trust from their teams. Transformative leaders are able to lead with compassion without being afraid. They're able to, show up courageously and vulnerably. That's what makes a transformative leader. And when you have that, what ends up happening is that your teams trust you. Your teams are more creative because they're not afraid to be wrong. Your teams are able to expand more and make more money. And, yes, money's not the only thing that matters, but money's important when you're thinking about a business, because there's always a bottom line. And so I mentioned that in this topic, not because money's the only thing that matters, but because it's proven that when you have a transformative leader leading, your end of the year profits are also going up. That's why transformative leaders matter. And transformative leaders have high emotional intelligence. They're authentic, they're vulnerable, they're compassionate, they're able to lead in a way that people trust them and want to come along. They leave their ego at the door as much as you can do that, although that's really hard to do. That's what transformative leaders do. And that's the leadership that makes a difference. And to speak to your data point about, this, and I just looked at it, I just kind of saw it in my mind's eye as a graph. If you graph your sort of professional acceleration,
Yes.
if that's sort of what you're looking at, your professional acceleration, how fast you're going to excel in your profession, if you were to graph that, what would be happening is indirectly, you would probably be having a downward curve of your personal relationships. If your only focus is on professional acceleration, guess what? Everything that you're going to be doing, every priority in life is going to be your profession, your career. You're going to be working all the time. And guess you are not going to be spending time building the relationships that matter. That's just true. And if you do it the other way around, I'm not saying that you don't focus on your career. Hello, I excelled so quickly because I focused so much in my career. But I also realized, and I'm so grateful that it happened to me really early on. I also realized that my marriage is the most important relationship that I can have. When my husband and I are on the upswing, because marriages are like anything, right? They ebb and flow, Alexandra. So when my
Yes.
marriage is on an upswing, my entire life is sort of in an upswing. And when my marriage is in a downswing, I live in my marriage. I'm home. I sleep with the person, like my whole life feels it. And it's not necessarily as like a one for one, as I mentioned, but you definitely feel that effect. And I remember my dad telling me this. My mom and dad are divorced, by the way, but before I got married, my dad said, you have to be very intentional about who you marry, because that is the most important decision you will ever make in your life. And it's kind of obvious, but it makes so much sense now.
Amazing. Yeah. I, of course, when I hear that concept, think immediately of Sheryl Sandberg, who was the COO of Facebook. She was very clear that the most important career decision you make is whom you marry. Let's just pivot. I'll take responsibility for it not being so graceful. And will you talk about stress, burnout, overstimulated nervous systems, navigating modern life, and what it takes to develop a deep, meaningful, passionate, romantic relationship, which includes being slow, being present, being open to things that are uncomfortable, like all of the things that we just turn away from in order to be successful in a high stress, high ambition, overwhelming life.
Absolutely. Okay, so you initially invited me to be on this podcast because you heard me speaking with my resiliency hat on. So for the audience that doesn't know, I had a experience with burnout, as many physicians do. And again, I'm grateful that mine was early on and that I was able to pivot. But the reason why I was able to excel so quickly in my career was because all I did was focus on my career. And so, I always said my family came first, my marriage came first. But if you ever looked at my calendar, it was
Mhm.
never a reflection of what I was saying. Whatever was scheduled in my calendar was always work. Every second that I had empty, it's like, oh, how can I fit in another work call here? What can I do here? And the problem was that clearly when you overwork like that, and you're always focusing on your career, you're not leaving time for the other things that matter. Okay, so I burnt out and a bunch of other
Will you
stuff.
just define burnout? I think that's one of those buzzwords which people throw around, but it actually means something quite specific. So, will you paint the picture of the burnt out version of the high achieving you?
Oh, yeah, that's a great. Okay, so first, let me just tell everyone listening that burnout is a spectrum. And you will ebb and flow through the spectrum of burnout. Burnout happens when you're experiencing stress and you no longer have the coping mechanisms to meet that level of stress. Oftentimes, you can experience stress and you cope just fine, and you cope just fine, and you cope just fine. And as you're moving over the spectrum, you don't have the coping mechanisms anymore for that level of stress. And that's when burnout happens. So, burnout is a chronic stress reaction from just experiencing so much acute stress over and over again. And it's marked by three things. So the definition of burnout always has to have these three things. Number one, it's kind of like an exhaustion, and you can either have emotional exhaustion, and you see this a lot in kind of like the XY chromosomes, people that tend to be more XY, have more testosterone on the gender spectrum. They're kind of more emotionally withdrawn. But you can also see physical exhaustion. So you hear this a lot in women. I'm so tired. I'm so exhausted. If you're more on the XX spectrum of the gender spectrum. And so emotional exhaustion, number one, is lack of sense of personal accomplishment. This is when you're like doubting the meaning of your work. Ugh, what's the point? Why do I have to go to work? What I do doesn't matter. This is just so meaningless. It's so pointless. If somebody else was here, they would do the same exact thing. Oh my gosh. As I'm saying this, I'm like remembering me saying the same exact words to the person that was my direct report.
Mm.
Okay, so lack of sense of personal accomplishment. And then the last one is in medicine, we call it poor bedside manner, but it's this need to sort of vent about your job. It's like you're sarcastic, you're cynical, and you're finding yourself complaining a lot about your job. So those three things, you're emotionally exhausted or physically exhausted, you have a lack of sense of personal accomplishment, and then you have the need to sort of vent about your job.
Okay, I have a question about that. With the term burnout as it's used, does it always apply to the professional context for those three criteria being met? Because when you're talking about emotional or physical exhaustion, a lack of personal accomplishment, and I'll say progress. And what was the
Need
third
to
one?
vent about the need to vent
And the
about.
need to vent about the challenges. That sounds like the way a lot of unhappy people feel about their marriages. So that's my question. Is burnout specifically a term that's used for professional context, or is it really for any aspect of life when one can technically be burnt out with parenting? Is that right?
100%. So burnout is a universal term. We use the term compassion fatigue, which is kind of parallel to burnout for more professionals that are in helping professions. So like physicians,
Mhm.
advanced providers, they experience compassion fatigue, but they sort of go hand in hand. There's a little nuance difference, but they sort of go hand in hand. But burnout is for anything. You can be burnt out. And I'm glad that you asked me to define it because we throw it around so much.
So
People are like, I was
much.
so burnt out after the weekend. Really? I don't think that's burnout. Maybe you're just tired.
Right, because one of the hallmarks, which you didn't, well, it's inferred in what you said, but one of the things about burnout is that we feel like we can't get over it. We can't get on top of it. We can't turn. And the difference between that over months and years versus feeling burnt out over the weekend is that, okay, you're burnt out over the weekend, take a nap, take a hot shower, and have a cup of coffee, and you'll be all right. And that just doesn't work when there's burnout from life experience over the long run.
Oh, so good. I'm so glad you mentioned that. Just like any chronic problem, burnout is a chronic stress problem. Like any chronic problem, you have diabetes, it's not going to get better overnight. You've got to take your medications and and the longer you wait to take care of something, the more chronic it becomes, as 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 a physician, the harder it is to treat. The same exact thing with burnout. The longer you wait to take care of it, the more chronic it becomes, the harder it is to treat. I feel really fortunate because I feel like my burnout was clearly coming. I was walking up this spike, and then I had a bunch of stuff happen at the same time in my life, both personal and professionally, as it happens. And and my stress started manifesting into physical symptoms, and that's how I knew something was wrong. And that for me was a huge kind of turning point in my life for everything. I was like, "Whoa, I need to take a step back here." So the reason why I mentioned that is that's sort of what led me to all my resiliency, my wellness work. I became certified as a compassion fatigue educator and therapist. I became a National Resiliency Director for a large physician organization, and I taught physicians how to get on the other side of this. I mean, it took me about a year myself to recover. And then after that, I dove headfirst into learning all these things and how to teach other people because I didn't want anyone else to experience this.
Okay, so let's say I am in my car listening to this conversation. I've been married for 17 years. My job is I'm just burnt out. I don't need to like figure out a bunch of details because I'm just burnt out. And I've just dropped my kids off somewhere and I'm headed home, and my husband's waiting for me because we've had a date night on the calendar for 3 weeks. Help me.
Okay, the first thing I will say is congratulations for being married for 17 years. That's a huge accomplishment. And then I'll say, listen, if you're burnt out and you're stressed, I'm not going to go through the whole physiology of it, but just know that you have your stress hormones up high. And when your stress hormone is essentially just cortisol, and it seems simple, just cortisol. It's a steroid that we know is so common to us, and it's flooding our systems when we're chronically stressed out. And when you're experiencing chronic stress, you're dropping your kids off, picking them up, going to work, all of those little things, being in traffic, getting a call from a boss, all of those little things are always getting triggered. When we're chronically living in stress, it's like we have our car on idle mode all of the time. That cortisol is always on, always running, and we're not giving it a time to turn off. We're not resetting our bodies. So you can reset your bodies though. You definitely can reset your bodies. And that's what a lot of resilience tools teach you to do is how to reset your body to turn off your stress response. So you're in your car, you're on your way home, you're going to go on a date night. So the first thing I'll ask you is, do you want to have the date night? If the answer is yes, which it probably is, then I want you to right now just switch your mindset from, oh, go ahead.
Actually, what I think the answer, as I'm role playing this, my answer is I want to because I like the idea of it, but I don't feel like it right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you want to feel like it right now?
Yes, I do. Can you help me with that?
Yeah. Well, that's the very first thing, right? The very first thing is acknowledging whether or not you actually want to show up. do you want to show up and be present for a date night? And if the answer is yes, then I can help you. If the answer is no, then there's a bunch of other questions, right, that we get to ask. But if the answer is yes, you want to show up, then we shift the mindset right away. You start by, I'm choosing to show up for this date. And then we turn off your stress response. Just in those, like, whatever 5-10 minutes you have to drive home, you can reset your body. And do you want me to go through it?
Yeah, I do. Because
Okay.
I'm not going to, I mean, maybe I could pull over, but in the 5 to 10 minutes that I'm driving, I'm not going to close my eyes and meditate for obvious reasons.
Exactly. So there's one thing that I love to do, and I actually practice this in the morning when I'm on my way to work, if I've had a stressful event at home before I left, or on my way home from the hospital, in between, patients, or in between some of my coaching clients. I practice this in between if I need to calm my body down. And when your stress response is on because you can feel it. You feel it in your gut, you feel it in your chest. You just know. Okay, so what I want everyone to do, and you can do this right now if you're listening, because you don't have to turn anything off. You don't have to close your eyes. All you need to do is acknowledge that there's something going on in your body. I'm a little bit stressed out right now. Oh, so frustrating. I don't want to be like this. Okay, so I'm going to reset. So I'm going to teach you all how to do something called box breathing. Box breathing is old school breathing method. It's been practiced forever. I did not make it up, but it's been so successful. They even teach it in the military, and they've been teaching it there forever because it really helps people reset. And what it does is it gets you out of your primitive brain, because you're right now, when you're any type of stress, what happens is your body sort of internalizes that as fear, triggers your stress response, which is your amygdala. Amygdala is part of your primitive brain, and it moves you away from responding from your higher order brain, or your prefrontal cortex, which is the one part of the brain that separates humans from all other mammals, right? It's what makes us who we are. And what we want to do, the prefrontal cortex, is how we're more thoughtful, how we're more conscious, how we're more present. And that's stimulated when we feel safe. So the way to do that is to turn off your stress response and then turn on your relaxation response, because both your stress response, which is your sympathetic nervous system firing, that cannot be on at the same time as your parasympathetic nervous system.
I remember you saying that in the other interview I heard, and it really struck me. I mean, I guess that's true to my experience, but it's just not something that I'd ever put attention on. That we can't, I mean, it's so basic, but we can't be stressed and relaxed at the same time. We can't have our sympathetic nervous system activated and our parasympathetic nervous system activated at the same time. Like, there is always a choice. I mean, I don't have more to say about that. I just really wanted to underline it because in a moment of stress, that feels like real wisdom.
Yeah, that's so true. And so, what I love to teach, this one simple thing, it's called box breathing. It's just so simple, and it's easy to use in real time, anytime you're stressed out. So, you can use it if you're chronically stressed on the way home and you really want to reset your body, or if you've experienced acute stress, someone just yelled at you. I'm an ER doc, acute stress all of the time, right? And
Yes,
so,
yes, yes.
and so I get to reset my body all of the time. Okay, so what you do is essentially you're going to do 4 things. And the way I want you to think about this is visualize 4 sides of a box. With every side of the box, you're going to do an action for 4 seconds. And don't do it yet. I'm going to walk you through it. But for the first side of the box, you're going to inhale, then hold your breath, then exhale, and then hold your breath. Okay, for 4 seconds each. Now, when you're inhaling, what I want you to do, that's usually when you feel stressed. So for me, I know I'm pretty connected to my body. So I know what my body does when I get triggered. So it's important, if you're trying to practice this for acute stress, try to be conscious of what your body does, because your body reacts before your brain has had a chance to process. That's how our primitive brain works. That's how it keeps us alive. That's how we jump out of a car, when it's about to hit us. So acknowledge what your body's doing. And then, so for me, I feel stressed out and I'm like, oh, here I go. I do 2 things consistently. I clench my jaw and I ball up my fist. And so as soon as I feel my nails in the palm of my hand or my jaw clenched, I'm like, okay, I'm stressed. It's time for me to 4x4. So I take 4 deep breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you hold your breath for 4 seconds. For those 4 seconds while you're holding your breath, acknowledge what your body's doing. Ooh, my jaw's tight. My fists are clenched. My stomach feels kind of funny. My chest is tight. Whatever you do when you feel stressed out. And just do that for 4 seconds. And then you exhale. Again, exhalation is the relaxation response. It's when you're turning off your parasympathetic nervous system. So you do 4 breaths of exhalation, and that's your chance to return your body to relax, to neutral. So I just relax. I open my palms of my fist. I put them to my side. I relax my jaw. I exhale. And then you do the last 4 seconds and I just acknowledge myself. I'm like, good job, Vanessa. Way to not snap at that person. And so what I want to tell you, if you're driving home, I want you to do that the entire way home if you need to, but for at least five. In the military, they say to do it for 5 minutes. And in an acute stress situation, you probably only need about 90 seconds to turn off your sympathetic nervous system.
Especially if I'm practicing on a regular basis, and then I don't need the extra frontal cortex activity to instruct myself as I do it, then I'm sure the results come faster.
Totally. And so if you're on the way home to a date, what I'd want you to ask yourself as you're doing this is, what am I looking forward to? How will this be great? How is this a good thing for us? And ask yourself those things so you can start prepping your brain as you're relaxing your body and your mind.
That's so beautiful. So let go of the stress and anticipate the benefits.
100%. Totally. Because this is the thing about, at least my perspective about relationships, is that your relationship will be what you decide it will be. So I mentioned earlier that my parents were divorced. And so for a long time, I had this attachment to divorce. I just assumed marriages ended in divorce. So why get married? It sounds so pointless. You're just going to divorce. And I remember when I met my husband, this incredible man. I'm so fortunate. And he comes from a more traditional family where they stayed married. And for him, that was just part of his plan. He was going to get married. And I remember thinking and asking him, like, why? Why do you want to get married? The marriage is just ended in divorce. It's so bananas now that I used to make that connection without ever questioning it. So then I decided, okay, fine. If I decide I don't want to get married, it's not going to be because I'm afraid of divorce. So I went to therapy and I worked out a lot of problems. And I'm like, all right, cool. I'm not afraid of marriage anymore. We can get married. And then I decided, all right, if I'm going to get married, then my marriage is going to be amazing. I'm going to create a legacy of passion, of love for my kids, for their kids to see. That's my intention if I'm going to go all the way. And that's what I decided. And so I just went for it. And I think that anybody can do that. You can just decide what you want your marriage to be and show up that way. Because if I have a date night coming up, and I want it to be fun or joyful, I'm going to show up that way. If I want to be passionate, then I'm going to show up that way, and then you become a source of whatever it is that you want.
I was just going to ask you, what is one of your tips for having the most fantastic relationship, but you've just given it. It's that if you want to have a particular kind of experience with your husband, you bring that energy. And I'm assuming that's an invitation he would never want to resist and can't.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I think, in my experience, relationships are the most interesting things because they're as complicated as like the way you think about sometimes your relationship with money is like your relationship with love. It's so complicated and based on so many things we've experienced growing up. And what I find interesting is some people have no problem being totally, vulnerable in certain parts of their marriage, but not 100%. Like there's something, they're afraid of something. Maybe it's money, maybe it's sex, maybe it's, whatever it is. And I think that vulnerability, and as you know this, I think that's like the key to intimacy, right? When you feel safe to be vulnerable, oh my gosh, it's just the key to intimacy.
I completely agree with you that vulnerability is the key to intimacy. And the name of my book is Uncompromising Intimacy. And what I'm pointing to with uncompromising is that when we learn to bring all of who we are to the relationship, we don't necessarily always get our way, but we get to create something incredibly magical and gratifying because it's based on the truth of who we are and not compromising and avoiding vulnerability and leaving some important aspects of ourselves outside the relationship. So, yes, I think vulnerability, it's the magic ingredient, not on any particular topic, but that we are willing to bring who we are.
And I'll just say that I 100% agree with you. And that doesn't mean that it's easy. And I know for me specifically, certain parts of my life, I struggle with vulnerability because I'm human, all humans do, right? And so I know I'm not unique in this, but I just want to say that even though it feels hard, doesn't mean you can't do it. It doesn't mean anything's gone wrong. So if you're practicing being vulnerable with your partner and it feels hard, and the last thing I would want you to do is say, I should be more vulnerable. This should be easier. I should be doing this, because the truth is that it's going to be hard and that's okay. I say this out loud now to the people listening, but also to myself. That's like the most precious time to practice self-compassion because it's going to be hard, but it doesn't mean that you're not safe. And I think that's the thing, that whenever vulnerability feels hard is because your stress response is getting triggered and you're feeling unsafe. Like, I got to stop talking because something's going to happen. I feel unsafe, you know? And the truth is, and what I like to tell myself is, when I feel unsafe, and I remember telling my husband something the other day, felt like we had a vulnerability hangover. I think Brene Brown calls it a vulnerability hangover.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. And so we had experienced something. And then the next day I woke up and I was like, oh my gosh, I just feel like, oh, everyone saw me. I'm so naked, you know? And I told myself, I wanted to tell my husband how I was feeling, but I was like afraid. And I was like, whoa, this is interesting. I'm catching myself not wanting to share because I didn't want to be vulnerable. And so in my mind, I just said, all right, Vanessa, you're safe. You're safe in this place. Nothing's going to happen. And, you know, I shared, and obviously it brings you closer together when you can be vulnerable.
Yeah. So the way that I teach it is I really think that we need to develop skills on being vulnerable, all kinds of things, and do that on topics that aren't that important so we can develop the skills and trust ourselves with the skills before going to the actual content that is more confronting. But there's something that you just said about when things feel vulnerable, it's because we don't feel safe, which is because we feel stressed. And I'm wondering if that, following each of those connections, if we need to somehow work through a stress response. I mean, is it possible to be vulnerable without being stressed? That's the question I'm asking.
Oh, so good. That's such a good question. No.
That's so interesting because based on my experience, I would say yes, but that is not based on the data. So, which you're very oriented to. So, this is like the most fascinating question.
Totally. Because, you know, you'll read this everywhere. And I don't know who coined it, but I know Brene Brown has said it, which is vulnerability is courage.
Yes.
And guess what? There is no courage without fear. And what is fear? That's your stress response. So vulnerability is your sense, it's your feeling, it's what you're feeling inside. I feel vulnerable, right? And so, yeah, you can then say something after you've switched and said, okay, I'm safe, I'm okay. And then you can share something, which means now you're acting out the vulnerability, you're saying it out loud, but you felt that stress before, right? And so I think if you're feeling safe and you're being intimate, maybe that's just intimacy. Maybe that's not vulnerability. I don't know. That's a great question.
Yeah, we're not going to resolve it right now, but I am so inspired to look at the evolutionary contribution of stress in the context of the conversation we're having that, yeah, I want to think about this because I haven't thought of vulnerability as stressful after one has been vulnerable enough times to trust the process. But maybe that's just overriding the stress enough to get through it. This is just an interesting conversation and topic that we can leave there. But any final words that you want to put to this?
Yeah, this did kind of bring up a lot of kind of thought questions for me. But you know, when you think about vulnerability, vulnerability means you're in danger. That's the term, right? You're vulnerable. Something might get you. You're in danger. That's what vulnerability means. In an emotional context, it means that we're afraid that, you know, back in the days, the whole response was you need to live in a tribe to survive. And so if you say something that makes you look like a fool, you might get kicked out of the tribe and you'll freeze to death or get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or have nothing to eat, whatever. Point is, you know, you need to stay with your tribe. And that's where the whole thing about humiliation comes in, right? That's why it's so scary. You don't want to be humiliated and get kicked out. So I would just say that it's fascinating to think about. And you're right, we're not going to resolve it. So I should stop trying. I will just say that it's not always easy and it's really important. And I trust that everybody listening has the courage to be vulnerable when it comes to their marriages.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'm going to take from this conversation is a much deeper appreciation of how stress is a part of this whole cycle. So I know you talked about the Latina Leadership Accelerator. Any final words on where people can find you? We'll definitely have your website and the links to the accelerator in the show notes. But anything else about someone who might like to continue the conversation with you?
Yeah. So if you're interested, you want to learn more, you want to work with me, you can find my website, vanessacalderonmd.com. The Latina Leadership Accelerator is evergreen. So we're accepting applicants year round if you're interested. And it's a 6-month program that will definitely accelerate both your personal and your professional development. And the things you learn are just exponential. Once you're able to manage guilt, imagine the effect of never having to make decisions based on guilt again. It's just fascinating, the things that we cover. The same thing with confidence. Once you're able to let go of self-doubt, can you imagine showing up confidently in every part of life? I think about my mom, who's an incredible woman, and she's in her 60s. And she told me that something happened at about 55 or 60 where she's able to show up like that everywhere. And I was like, do I have to wait to turn that age? And the answer is no, you don't. You just have to know how to do it. Anyway, yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
Okay, but I just have to ask one question. Do you need to be like Latina to join the accelerator? I think that's a question people are going to have while they're listening.
Yeah, you don't. You can reach out to me. In about a year, we are turning into a group program, and you will have to be Latina, but right now is your chance. If you're not Latina and you're interested and you want to get in, this is the time to join.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Marriage Podcast. Please rate and review the show on iTunes. It really makes a difference. And if you have a question or a comment, reach out to me via my website at alexandrastockwell.com.